March 27th, 1977. Los Rodeos Airport, Tenerife, 5:06 in the afternoon. A KLM Boeing 747 begins rolling down the runway. Captain Jacob Van Zanten pushes the throttles forward full power. The engines scream. 400 meters ahead of him, completely invisible through the dense fog, a Pan Am 747 is still on the same runway. Neither plane can see the other. The KLM co-pilot says, "Is he not clear then?" Van Zanten doesn't answer. He doesn't slow down. In the next 12 seconds, 583 people die. It remains the deadliest aviation accident in history. And the chain of decisions that caused it began 14 hours earlier in a way that nobody aboard either aircraft had any way to predict. To understand Tenerife, you need to understand one thing about Jacob Van Zanten. His face was on KLM's safety posters. Not because he was reckless, because he was considered the safest, most experienced 747 pilot the airline had. He had trained most of KLM's other 747 captains personally. He had logged more hours in that aircraft than almost anyone alive. When you flew KLM in 1977, his photograph was the thing meant to make you feel safe. Van Zanten was not a man who made bad decisions. Until that afternoon, nothing in 43 years of aviation had suggested otherwise. What happened on the runway at Los Rodeos was a result of pressure, fog, a miscommunication lasting less than 2 seconds, and one man who had spent his career being right about everything, making one catastrophic exception. Before we get to the specific chain of events, it's worth pausing on something. In commercial aviation in 1977, the authority of a captain in his own cockpit was close to absolute. The culture of commercial aviation, inherited directly from military aviation culture, placed the captain at the apex of an unquestioned hierarchy. Junior crew did not challenge captains. Co-pilots suggested cautiously. Flight engineers raised concerns in the mildest possible terms. This cultural reality would matter enormously in what happened inside the KLM cockpit in the final minutes before the collision. That afternoon, a bomb had exploded at Las Palmas Airport on Gran Canaria. 2 KLM and Pan Am 774s, both originally bound for Las Palmas, were diverted to Los Rodeos on Tenerife instead. Los Rodeos was a small regional airport. It had one runway. It was not equipped to handle 2 fully loaded jumbo jets simultaneously, but it was the closest option. So both planes landed and waited for Las Palmas to reopen. Both planes sat nose to tail on the single taxiway. Engines shut down. Passengers settled in for an indefinite wait. The KLM plane had refueled during the wait. Van Zanten had ordered a full fuel load, partly to save time when they eventually got to Las Palmas, and partly because a full 747 is more maneuverable on the ground than a partially loaded one. The refueling added to the delay. It also made the plane heavier, which affected everything about what happened next. They waited for hours. During that time, a dense fog rolled in from the surrounding hills. Visibility dropped to around 300 meters. The planes sat side by side on the taxiways, engines off. Passengers moved around the cabins. Some walked into the terminal. The hours passed. Here is the detail that matters. KLM's crew had a problem that the Pan Am crew didn't. Aviation regulations set strict limits on how many consecutive hours a flight crew can be on duty before they're legally required to rest. Van Zanten's crew was approaching that limit. If they didn't take off within a certain window, they would have to spend the night in Tenerife. The flight would be canceled. Hundreds of passengers would be stranded. The airline would face costs and reputational damage. The pressure was real, and Van Zanten felt it. The Pan Am captain, Victor Grubbs, had watched the KLM refueling with some frustration. His passengers were already restless. Some of them had gotten off the plane during the wait and would now need to be rounded up and reboarded. Every minute of delay compounded the irritation of a flight that had already been significantly disrupted by events they had nothing to do with. What nobody on either flight fully appreciated in those hours of waiting on the taxiway at Los Rodeos was that the conditions for a catastrophic accident were assembling themselves with the methodical indifference of physics. The fog was coming in. The schedule was compressing. Two very large aircraft were about to attempt to maneuver simultaneously in a space not designed for them. And on one of them, a man with decades of flawless aviation experience was about to run out of time. When Las Palmas finally reopened and the planes were cleared to start their engines, the Pan Am aircraft needed to taxi out first. It was blocking the KLM plane's route to the runway. But the taxiway system at Los Rodeos was too small for two 747s to maneuver simultaneously. The controller instructed both planes to use the main runway itself to reach the departure threshold, then told Pan Am to exit the runway at a specific taxiway exit and hold there while KLM departed. The fog was now so dense that the controller in the tower could not see the runway. The pilots could not see each other. Radio communication was the only thread connecting everyone on that airport. At some point in the sequence of communication, investigators later analyzed every recorded transmission from that afternoon with extraordinary care. Van Zanten's sense of the situation had diverged from reality. He believed he had received permission to take off. The air traffic controller had not granted it. The gap between those two positions was a handful of seconds of radio transmission. A burst of static interference from two simultaneous transmissions, and the weight of everything that had been building since the bomb went off at Las Palmas hours earlier. And it was about to fail in the most consequential possible way. KLM reached the end of the runway, turned around, and lined up for departure. They were supposed to wait for an explicit takeoff clearance. What Van Zanten received instead was a route clearance, the ATC telling him which route to fly after takeoff. It was not the same thing as clearance to take off. But in the tension and urgency of that moment, with the crew's duty clock running down, Van Zanten appears to have interpreted it as permission to go. The KLM flight engineer said aloud, "Is he not clear of the Pan Am?" Van Zanten said yes. He released the brakes. The Pan Am crew, still taxiing on the same runway, heard the KLM flight engineer's question over the radio. Their captain immediately transmitted, "We're still on the runway." Simultaneously, the Los Rodeos controller transmitted, "Stand by for takeoff. I will call you." Both transmissions happened at exactly the same moment. The two signals collided in the radio spectrum, producing only a brief squelch, a burst of static that blocked both messages from being heard clearly on the KLM flight deck. Van Zanten heard nothing, or heard something he interpreted as clearance. He kept going. At approximately 160 kilometers per hour, the KLM jet emerged from the fog bank. The Pan Am captain saw the KLM 747 bearing down on them and turned hard left, trying to get off the runway. He almost made it. The KLM plane struck the Pan Am aircraft's upper fuselage with its landing gear. The KLM continued briefly into the air before crashing and exploding on the runway. Everyone aboard the KLM flight, 248 people, died. On the Pan Am, 61 people survived out of 396. Most of those who lived were in the forward section, which was sheared off and separated from the main fire. Jacob Van Zanten was found in the wreckage. The man whose face was on the safety posters had become the cause of the worst disaster in the history of commercial aviation. The 36 hours that preceded the collision contained a further element of grim irony. The KLM aircraft's captain, Van Zanten, had been so focused on minimizing the total delay of the flight that when the planes were finally cleared to start engines, he had made a decision that cost additional time. Rather than beginning to taxi immediately, he ordered a complete refueling of the KLM aircraft, filling it to its maximum fuel capacity. His logic was efficient. Arriving at Las Palmas with a full tank would save turnaround time there. The refueling took approximately 35 minutes. During those 35 minutes, the Pan Am aircraft was blocked from taxiing because the KLM plane was in its way at the refueling point. Had the refueling not occurred, or had it occurred in a different sequence, the two aircraft might have reached their departure positions at different times, eliminating the scenario in which they were simultaneously in each other's way on the runway. Van Zanten's attempt to save time contributed to the delay that made the duty time problem worse. The fog that descended over Los Rodeos that afternoon was also not simply bad luck. The airport's location, in a valley between two mountain ranges on a volcanic island, made it consistently prone to sudden, dense fog formation in the late afternoon when temperature differentials between the Atlantic air and the mountain terrain created the conditions for rapid cloud condensation. This was known by pilots who flew into Los Rodeos regularly. It was the reason the airport was considered challenging for inexperienced crews. Neither Van Zanten nor the Pan Am captain, Victor Grubbs, were inexperienced, but the fog created conditions in which their individual competence was secondary to the fundamental limitation that neither aircraft could see the other. The investigation that followed was, in certain aspects, uncomfortable for the aviation industry, because Van Zanten had not acted irrationally. He had acted under pressure in a way that felt consistent with his responsibilities. He had made a reasonable inference from ambiguous communication. He had been in a situation where all the incentives pushed toward acting rather than waiting. The question that emerged from Tenerife was not simply why a talented pilot made a mistake. It was why aviation had built a culture and a communication system in which such a mistake was possible at all. The accident led to sweeping changes in how air traffic control communicates with flight crews. The phrase takeoff became restricted to air traffic controllers, using it only when granting explicit clearance, eliminating the ambiguity that had killed 583 people. Crew resource management training was introduced across commercial aviation globally, specifically targeting the cultural reluctance of junior crew to challenge senior captains. The dynamic that had kept the KLM co-pilot and engineer from stopping a takeoff they both had doubts about. The investigation also found contributing causes including ATC procedures at Los Rodeos that were inadequate for the concurrent operation of two large aircraft in low visibility. The absence of ground radar at the airport that would have allowed controllers to track aircraft positions in the fog, and the specific phrase, "We are now at takeoff," used by the KLM flight engineer when transmitting to the controller. A non-standard phrase whose ambiguity was not immediately recognized as such by either the controller or the Pan Am crew. The changes to ATC communication protocols that resulted from Tenerife were profound and permanent. The word takeoff became restricted to a single, precisely defined use, the controller's explicit clearance to take off. All other uses of the word in the approach and departure sequence were replaced with alternative terminology. The crew, for example, would say rolling when beginning their takeoff roll, rather than any formulation involving the word takeoff. The purpose was to ensure that No pilot could ever again conflate a route clearance with a takeoff clearance, because the word takeoff appeared in a context that allowed ambiguity. These changes, along with the introduction of crew resource management training that specifically addressed captain authority and junior crew assertiveness, are credited with contributing substantially to the declining accident rate in commercial aviation over the decades since 1977. The rate of aviation fatalities per passenger mile has fallen dramatically since Tenerife. The changes built from that disaster are part of why. Spanish investigative report placed primary blame on the KLM captain. KLM accepted responsibility and paid compensation to victims' families without a prolonged legal battle. Van Zanten himself was never on trial. He had died in the crash that his decision caused. Los Rodeos Airport was later renamed Tenerife North Airport. A memorial stands near the site. 583 people, the largest aviation death toll in history, caused by a man who didn't want to be late. The crash site on the runway at Los Rodeos burned for hours. The two aircraft, a combined mass of several hundred tons of aviation fuel, cargo, and metal, produced fires that emergency services could not fully extinguish until the early hours of the following morning. The runway was destroyed. The airport was closed. Recovery of remains began the next day in conditions that first responders described as among the most difficult they had ever encountered. The identification of victims took weeks. The passenger lists for both flights contained nationals from dozens of countries, and the international coordination required to return remains to families was among the largest such operations ever conducted up to that point following a civilian aviation accident. If you want to understand the disasters where the systems that exist to prevent catastrophe become the systems that cause it, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.